me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I didn't think much of it when my nephew called to say he was coming by. Visits were rare, but not unheard of. Families drift, then circle back, especially when life starts asking harder questions. I was in my late 40s then, settled into a small house at the edge of town, the kind of place where the evenings arrive slowly and the mornings are quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. He said he'd be passing through, needed a place to rest for a day or two. I said yes without hesitation, because that's what you do, and because somewhere inside me I was curious about the man he was becoming. The day he arrived, the sky was stretched wide and pale, the kind of blue that makes everything feel honest. I remember wiping down the kitchen counter for no real reason, straightening a stack of old magazines, glancing out the window more times than necessary. When his car pulled into the driveway, I recognized him immediately and yet felt the distance of years in the way he moved, the way he stood there for a second before knocking, like he was reminding himself where he was. He looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in weight. Life had already pressed its fingerprints onto him. We hugged, briefly but warmly, and I felt that familiar mix of family closeness and polite distance. I took his bag, led him inside, offered coffee even though it was late afternoon. We talked about the drive, the weather, the usual safe topics that fill space before real words are ready. The house felt different with him in it. Sounds had somewhere to land. The floorboards creaked with purpose. We sat at the small wooden table by the window, sunlight cutting across it at an angle that made dust motes dance. He wrapped his hands around his mug and stared into it, like the answer to something might rise with the steam. I noticed then how quiet he was. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. I didn't rush him. Age teaches you that silence isn't empty. It's waiting. So I told him about the neighbor's dog that barked at nothing, about how the grocery store had rearranged everything again. He smiled politely, nodded, but his eyes stayed far away. Later, after he'd settled into the spare room and we'd eaten a simple dinner, we sat on the back porch. Evening had cooled the air, and the cicadas were starting up, that steady rhythm that feels like a heartbeat for the countryside. He leaned back in the chair, looking up at the darkening sky. "Auntie," he said finally, his voice low, "can I ask you something?" There it was, the moment I hadn't known I was waiting for. I told him of course, and meant it. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, and I could see the younger boy in him then, the one who used to trail behind me at family gatherings, asking questions that adults didn't always want to answer. He talked about feeling misunderstood, about carrying expectations that didn't quite fit. Not accusing anyone, not asking for fixes, just sharing. I listened, really listened. I didn't interrupt or correct or offer advice right away. I let him speak himself into the open air. As he talked, I realized how little I'd actually known about his inner life. Families often think proximity equals understanding, but it doesn't. It takes moments like this, unplanned and unguarded. I shared some of my own story then, not as a lesson, but as a parallel. Times I'd felt boxed in by assumptions, times I'd stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I could see his shoulders relax as he realized he wasn't alone in that feeling. There was no dramatic turning point, no sudden revelation, just a steady exchange that felt like laying stones across a stream, one by one, until you can cross without getting wet. The porch light flicked on automatically, bathing us in a soft yellow glow. The night smelled like cut grass and something sweet I couldn't quite place. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked, and how extraordinary it felt at the same time. When we finally went inside, the house settled around us again, but differently now. Warmer, more awake. I went to bed that night with my mind still humming, aware that something had shifted. not in a way that could be named easily, but in a way that mattered. Lying there in the dark, I had understood that the visit wasn't just about him stopping by. It was about seeing each other clearly without the noise of old roles and expectations. I didn't know then where the next days would lead, or how much more there was to uncover in the conversations still waiting to happen. I only knew that this unexpected visit had already given me a gift, the chance to understand him better, and in doing so, to understand myself in a way I hadn't anticipated. The next morning arrived gently, the way it often does when there's nowhere you have to be. Light slipped through the curtains, thin and patient, and for a moment I forgot he was there. Then I heard the soft clink of a mug in the kitchen and remembered. There was a quiet comfort in knowing someone else was awake, moving around, sharing the same small slice of morning. I took my time getting dressed, choosing an old sweater that smelled faintly of laundry soap and memories. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was standing by the window, looking out at the backyard like it held some secret. He turned when he heard me and smiled, more relaxed than the day before. "Hope it's okay, I made coffee," he said. I laughed and told him that was more than okay. We sat across from each other again, the same table, but the air between us felt different now, less guarded. The conversation came easier, drifting from the taste of the coffee to the way mornings change as you get older. I found myself noticing small things about him, the way he listened with his whole face, the way he paused before answering, as if he wanted to be precise, honest. After breakfast, I suggested a walk. There's a path not far from my house that winds through a stand of old trees and opens up near the river. I hadn't walked it in a while, not since my knees started reminding me of my age, but that day it felt right. He agreed immediately, pulling on his jacket like he'd been waiting for an excuse to move. The air outside was cool and clean. Fallen leaves crunched under our feet, and the trees stood tall and indifferent, witnesses to countless conversations like ours. We walked side by side at first, talking about neutral things, the kind of talk that stretches its legs before settling in. But gradually, without planning it, the conversation deepened. He spoke about choices he'd made, and some he hadn't, about feeling like he was always catching up to an idea of himself that kept moving. I didn't interrupt. I just nodded, occasionally offering a small acknowledgement, letting him know I was still there, still listening. There's a kind of listening that feels like a gift, and I could tell he felt it. At one point, we stopped near the river. The water moved steadily, unconcerned with us, carrying reflections of the sky along its surface. He leaned against the railing, looking down, and said something that stayed with me. "I think I've been afraid to say things out loud," he admitted. "Like once I do, they become real." I understood that fear more than I wanted to admit. I told him about a time in my own life when I'd kept quiet for years, convincing myself that silence was safer. How, in the end, it had only made me feel smaller. I wasn't preaching. I was confessing. There's a difference, and people can feel it. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw a shift. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. As if he was seeing me not just as an aunt or an older relative, but as a person who'd lived, stumbled, learned. That kind of recognition goes both ways. On the walk back, we talked about lighter things. Music from different decades, how certain songs can pull you backward in time without warning. He teased me gently about my taste, and I defended it with mock seriousness. Laughter came easily, surprising us both. Back at the house, the afternoon unfolded slowly. He helped me with a small repair I'd been putting off, tightening a loose hinge on the back door. We worked side by side, exchanging small comments, comfortable in the shared task. It struck me how these ordinary moments often do the most work, building trust without announcing themselves. Later, we sat in the living room, sunlight fading, shadows stretching across the floor. I pulled out an old photo album from a shelf, one I hadn't opened in years. We flipped through it together, pausing on pictures of family gatherings, pointing out faces, telling stories that had grown fuzzy around the edges. He laughed at a picture of himself as a child, missing teeth, eyes bright. I watched his reaction more than the photo, noticing how his expression softened. Nostalgia can be a bridge, connecting who we were to who we are, and who we're still becoming. As evening approached, a quiet settled in again, but this time it wasn't tentative. It was companionable. We didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. When we did speak, it was because there was something worth saying. That night, after dinner, he thanked me. Not in a dramatic way, just a simple acknowledgement. For listening. For not rushing him. For making space. I told him he didn't owe me thanks, that this was part of what family is supposed to be. But inside, I felt something warm and steady. A sense that this visit was becoming something more meaningful than either of us had expected. When I went to bed, the house quiet again, I lay awake thinking about how understanding doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from walking alongside someone, matching their pace, and letting the truth unfold in its own time. I sensed that there was more ahead, more conversations waiting just beyond the edge of sleep, and I felt ready for them. By the third day, the visit had found its own rhythm. We no longer tiptoed around each other's schedules or moods. The house adjusted, as if it remembered how to hold more than one story at a time. Morning light felt warmer, even though the weather hadn't changed, or maybe it was just me. I woke earlier than usual and sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug, watching the steam curl upward. There's something about those quiet hours that makes reflection unavoidable. You start thinking about the paths that led you here, the people who passed through, the ones who stayed longer than expected. When I heard him come in, still a little sleepy, I smiled without meaning to. We talked about plans for the day, or rather the lack of them. That freedom felt like a luxury. Eventually we decided to drive into town. Nothing special, just errands and a bite to eat. The drive itself turned into its own conversation. Old roads have a way of loosening memories. We passed places that triggered stories for me, and I shared them without overthinking. He listened, sometimes asking questions that surprised me with their thoughtfulness. At the small diner on Main Street, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and handwritten specials, we sat across from each other with menus we barely looked at. The place smelled like coffee and fried onions, and the low hum of other conversations wrapped around us. Somewhere between the waitress refilling our cups and the clatter of plates from the kitchen, he said something quietly that shifted the mood again. "I don't talk like this with many people," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "I usually feel like I have to be a certain version of myself." I nodded, understanding that pressure all too well. I told him how easy it is to wear masks without realizing they've become part of your face. How sometimes it takes someone outside your usual circle to help you set them down. He looked relieved, as if the permission mattered. After lunch, we walked a bit through town. The pace was slow, unhurried. We paused in front of a bookstore, its window filled with faded paperbacks and handwritten notes taped to the glass. He went in, emerging a few minutes later with a book he said he'd been meaning to read. That small choice felt symbolic somehow, like a step towards something personal. Back at the house, the afternoon stretched out lazily. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, a comfortable distance, talking about the future in broad strokes. Not plans exactly, more like hopes. He spoke about wanting clarity, wanting to feel grounded. I talked about learning to accept where I was, without measuring it against anyone else's timeline. At one point, the conversation drifted into family history. The stories that get passed down, the ones that don't. We laughed at some of the old legends, shook our heads at others. but beneath the humor was a shared understanding that families are complicated, built on both love and misunderstanding. Naming that out loud felt freeing. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room, there was a moment of quiet that felt heavier than the others. Not uncomfortable, just charged. He broke it by asking me how I'd learned to be so patient. The question caught me off guard. I thought for a while before answering. I told him patience hadn't come naturally, that it was something I'd learned through mistakes, through moments when impatience had cost me connection. I admitted that I was still learning, still failing sometimes. He absorbed that, nodding slowly. What struck me then was how this visit had shifted my own perspective. I'd gone into it thinking I might offer guidance, maybe comfort. Instead, I found myself learning just as much. About listening without an agenda. About allowing relationships to evolve beyond their old shapes. That evening, we cooked together, moving around the kitchen with an ease that surprised me. Music played softly from my old radio, a station that favored classics. We commented on songs, shared associations, let the melodies fill the spaces between words. It felt simple and right. After dinner, we stepped outside again. The night was clear, stars sharp against the dark sky. We sat on the porch, not speaking much, just taking it in. Sometimes understanding doesn't need words. Sometimes it's enough to sit side by side, aware of each other's presence, sharing the same view. As I went to bed that night, I realized that whatever had been unspoken between us before was slowly finding its voice. Not in dramatic declarations, but in steady, honest moments. I sensed that we were nearing something important, a turning point that would give shape to everything we'd shared so far. And instead of feeling anxious, I felt calm, ready to meet it with the same openness that had brought us this far. The last morning came sooner than I expected. That's how it always goes when something matters. I woke before the alarm, the house wrapped in that early quiet that feels almost sacred. For a moment, I lay there listening, taking inventory of the sounds I'd grown used to over the past few days. Another person moving through the space. Another presence. It was comforting, and knowing it was temporary gave it a bittersweet edge. I found him in the kitchen again, standing by the counter, scrolling through his phone with a half-finished cup of coffee nearby. He looked up and smiled, and I could tell he'd slept better. There's a certain ease that shows up in the face when a mind has settled, even a little. We didn't rush breakfast. There was no need. His bag was already packed by the door, but neither of us mentioned it right away. We talked about the drive he had ahead of him, about traffic patterns and weather, the practical things people use to ease into goodbyes. Underneath it all was the awareness that something important had happened here, something neither of us wanted to cheapen by overstating it. At one point, he set his mug down and said, "I didn't know how much I needed this." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't have to. I nodded, feeling the truth of it land in my chest. I told him that I hadn't known I needed it either. That sometimes understanding sneaks up on you, wearing the clothes of an ordinary visit. Before he left, we took one last walk around the yard. The grass was damp, the air crisp. He paused near the old tree by the fence, the one that's been there longer than I have, and asked me if I ever regretted not making certain choices. It was a big question for such a quiet moment. I thought about it carefully. I told him that regret is a complicated thing, that I'd learned to see my life not as a series of wrong turns, but as a path that taught me how to listen better, how to stay open. I said that understanding often comes later, when you're finally still enough to recognize it. He took that in, hands in his pockets, eyes thoughtful. I could see the wheels turning, not in a restless way, but in a grounded one. That was new, and it mattered. When it was time for him to go, we hugged again, a little longer than the first time, but still respectful, still grounded in who we were to each other. Family. Two people who'd met in the middle of their lives and chosen to really see one another. I watched from the porch as he drove away, his car disappearing down the road until it was just another shape in the distance. The house felt quiet again, but not empty. It felt full in a different way, like a room after a good conversation lingers with echoes that don't fade right away. Later that afternoon, I sat with a book I never really read, my thoughts drifting back over the visit. What stayed with me wasn't any single conversation, but the way we'd shown up for each other. Without judgment. Without roles getting in the way. Just two people willing to listen. In the years since, I've thought about that visit often. About how understanding doesn't always come from grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from shared coffee, slow walks, honest questions asked in quiet rooms. Sometimes it comes from letting go of who you think someone is and making space for who they actually are. That visit helped me understand my nephew better, yes. But it also helped me understand something else just as important. That connection doesn't belong to any one age or stage of life. That it's never too late to listen differently, to open yourself up, to grow. And whenever the house feels too quiet now, I remind myself that silence can hold meaning too. That some visits don't end when the door closes. They stay with you, shaping how you listen, how you love, and how you move forward, a little wiser than you were before. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel for more like this stories.